Moving right along here, we're now at episode 6 of this series about optimizing an Angular component for reuse. I think it's been going great, and I hope you've learned a lot so far. We pretty much have our component in a really good spot, but what I want to do is talk about some sort of iterations and uses. This episode is going to focus on the label function, basically a callback function we pass into the component, and about how that can be used, and specifically scope around arrow functions versus regular functions, and how that can affect the way you may use this feature. I'm back here at code. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put a debugger statement in our concat_name label function. And this is the function we're going to sort of start to take a look at. This is a regular function, and we're going to put a debugger statement, then we can introspect, in essence, this from the browser. I'm going to bring up DevTools, and let's reload this. There. Get rid of that. This. So this here is the list component. So we'll have access to things like this, the data provider, this dot label field, this dot the label function. So it's often very confusing, because if inside this method it's not obvious the first time you sort of run into this. If I try to access this dot simple data provider, just log it out, it's going to get like an undefined error in the browser, strictly because although compiler wise it looks like this is appropriate, this label function is running in a completely different context. Let's resave that, and I'm going to reload. So the simple data provider is just not defined, so it's going to print out an undefined. Like everything still works. Let's everything still works, but we got a lot of undefineds. So that is the first time I ran into this, I really didn't know what was going on. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create another example. I'm going to just copy this concat_name label arrow function, and I'm going to turn this into an arrow function. Now with an arrow function, it runs in the context where this is created. So we will be able to dump out the data provider here, the simple data provider. We will not be able to access the internal variables of the list component, such as data provider label field label function, because this here will refer to app component and not list component. Let's create a sample that uses this one. Label function. There we go. And I'm going to comment out the debugger here, so it only stops in here. Oop, failed to compile. Oh, I got it. My first mistake, that was bound to happen. Once again, we don't want to call the function, we want to pass in the function. And then the list component deals with making calls. Let's re-enable debug points. And here, now we can access this simple data provider, because the this here is app component, it's not list component. So this difference of scoping gives us a lot of power. in theory, in a function like this, in a callback function, we should never be using regular functions. We should never, or rather, we should never use regular functions with the intent of accessing private internal variables of the component. As a consumer, we don't want that, but the option is there. So whenever I try to create these functions, callbacks in essence, I try to send as much data possible as arguments into the function that the user may need, so they don't have to introspect the internal function. But because that sort of breaks encapsulation is not the most perfect approach for development. But yeah, we can run this. Actually, that's going to go a lot. So I'm going to pause breakpoints again, switch over to the console, and as you see, we have a ton of outputs of the array, specifically the simple data provider array. I did a whole series of scopes, blog posts around scope for the arrow functions versus non-arrow functions. It was basically a precursor to this episode. And based on my simple samples, you don't have a lot of information to go on. There's not really a use case where we need to examine data either internal to the list component or from our consuming component. But in the real world, in more complicated stuff, it's entirely possible.